Welcome to the Narsai course. This is a Bible study because we're going to be spending most of the time talking about the Bible, in particular, Narsai's interpretation of 12 different scriptural passages or ideas. I'm Father Andrew Younan, and the textbook for this class is more or less going to be this book, my volume on Narsai, which just came out a few weeks ago. You can get this on Amazon. If you have a copy, that's great. If not, I'm not going to be referring to pages a lot, but if you do have your own copy, it'll help. Let me give kind of a course outline. I am going to spend 2 weeks, two classes on my introduction. So there's an introduction in this book. So this week I'm going to talk about who is Narsai. I'm going to talk about his life. Who is this guy that we're going to talk about? Next class, I'm going to be talking about his theology. I'm going to give a kind of summary of the totality of his thought. Then, starting with class 3, I'm going to work through this book chapter by chapter. I have a bunch of copies here that people can pick up, and if you want to buy them today, on your way out. What else do I want to say first? Narsai was a 5th century author of the Church of the East. He wrote a number of pieces that we sing or recite in our liturgy. So if you go, for example, to Sunday morning prayer, and we sing the hymns after the Psalms, we sing the Nohara hymns. The first one is by Saint Ephraim, Mar Ephraim. The second one is by Narsai. So he wrote some hymns that we still sing today on a weekly basis in the Chaldean church and the Assyrian churches and in the Malabar church. So, and 5th century means he was born somewhere around the year 400 and he died around or fairly close to the year 503. So he lived a very long life. He lived about 100 years, or either he lived 90 years or 100 years. It depends on how we read his biography. We'll talk about that a little bit today. So I want to say a couple of things before I jump into that. Why is he an interesting thinker to think about? And in general, why is our tradition, and the tradition that we're going to refer to, that I'm going to name, is the Church of the East. And I'm going to say the word Church of the East a lot, that phrase. You're going to hear that from me a lot. And there's a reason why I'm going to use that specific phrase. What does it mean to find something interesting? Let me start with just that very kind of vague concept. We find something interesting, it has to sort of have two shared properties. Something is interesting when we understand it, but not quite. If something is totally incomprehensible, if it makes no sense whatsoever, it's not interesting. But if something is so obvious that we already know it before somebody finishes their sentence, that's not interesting either. So for something to be interesting, it sort of has to be on the edge, on the periphery of where our knowledge kind of extends. So the Church of the East in general, and Narsai in particular, really are right there for the majority of Christians, and in particular Western Christians. And I think this actually applies to the Greek Orthodox traditions. People that are very faithful, they love God, they know what the Bible is, they know what the church is, they know what the sacraments are. Narsai has all those things in common. He has the same Bible, more or less. He has the same sort of church structure. He knows what bishops and priests and deacons are. He knows what the liturgy is. He knows what the sacraments are. So he has a lot of these things in common, and a lot of the stuff he says is fairly familiar. All right, well, God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Yeah, sure. He has all that. He ascribes to a lot of the same councils of the church that a lot of the other thinkers do. But because he's on the edge, and I'm going to describe exactly what the edge means, because he's right on the edge, he has some things to say that are like, whoa, out of the blue, I never would have thought of that in a million years. And there's a number of things that I found in studying and translating Narsai that I actually haven't found in any other Christian thinker. Certainly not from his period, but in many cases he has some insights that are like, wow, nobody else in Christian tradition really seems to say that, at least as far as I've seen. So that's why I hope this will be an interesting sort of 14 weeks for you. So in my book, this is just on page 2, I kind of say what I just said. So you can, if you're sort of following along with the book at home. I'm recording these, by the way, for, I think, Corbana Media. Is that what we're going to put? Yeah, for Corbana Media. So hi to everybody at home. I'm Father Andy. Okay. What do I mean by Church of the East? Because that's really the way to describe who Narsai is to say he is one of the preeminent authors, one of the important authors of the Church of the East. The Church of the East, I'm using that word, that phrase in particular, means the Christian church, the apostolic Christian church that grew and existed east of the Roman Empire. So all the other Christian churches, for the most part, I don't want to get into some details, but for the most part, all the other Christian churches, so the Latin church, the Roman Catholic Church, all the Greek churches, what's now the Russian church, the Byzantine traditions, even the Ethiopian, all these other sort of apostolic traditions were more or less within the Roman Empire. Now, when we talk about, I don't want to get to that yet, actually. So I want to say things sort of in order. That's the church that we're talking about now. Today, that Church of the East has branched out. I'm going to use a very kind of polite way to describe this. Has branched into several different distinct institutions. So there is the Chaldean Catholic Church, there is the Assyrian Church of the East, there is the ancient Assyrian Church of the East, and there is the Malabar Catholic Church. Those are the four branches that arose from what was originally just called the Church of the East. It did not have any other name than that. Okay? And so that means it didn't have any sort of national name to it. Okay? It wasn't called the Chaldean Catholic Church or Chaldean Church of the East. It wasn't called the Assyrian Church of the East. Those names came much later in history. Originally, it was just the Church of the East, and East just meant Persia. When the Persian Empire still existed. Okay? That's all it meant at the beginning, and then it just meant sort of east of the Roman Empire. Now, there are some wrong ways to think about how to categorize things. If you're, again, following along at home, more or less on page 5 of the book, you will read sometimes very prominent, important authors, very unfortunately, and fairly educated people will say things like Eastern Christianity, and they'll make some statement about the Eastern Church. And that is, even though there's sometimes very revered, good, holy, educated people who say that, that is like gibberish. It makes no sense at all to say the Eastern Church. There's no such thing as the Eastern Church. There are many Eastern churches. And there is almost nothing you can say that applies to just the Eastern churches, but not the Western Church. And in fact, what we'll find out, there are many things that the Church of the East and its traditions, Chaldean and Assyrian and Malabar, its traditions and its theology and the way that it does things, there's a lot of things that our tradition has in common with the far West Latin Church, but not some of the Greek churches. So it's just a kind of meaningless phrase to say the Eastern Church. And I'm kind of referring to, again, he did it with a very good heart, and he was an extremely good and holy and pious man and a saintly man, literally. John Paul II, he has a nice encyclical, and he says, the church has to breathe with both lungs, East and West. It's such an oversimplification that it's almost a meaningless phrase. It just means almost nothing to say that. There are many, many different Eastern traditions. And there are actually several Western traditions, not even just one. So that's one thing I just want to sort of point out when we're talking about who is Narsai. He's part of this Church of the East. Church of the East doesn't mean Eastern Church. Because now you're going to go, let's say you go to a Greek Orthodox church and you say, I'm learning about the Eastern Church Fathers. And they say, cool. Who are you learning about? You say, Narsai. If they've heard of who Narsai is, I'd be shocked. But if they have heard of who he is, they're going to say, he's a heretic and we condemned him. Okay? So just be aware, each of these traditions is kind of distinct. Another way to categorize things, which is sometimes convenient, is we categorize churches according to language. And so there are the Latin sort of traditions or churches. There's sort of different even liturgies within the Latin church. There are the Greek churches. I've even used that phrase in this lecture. And so these are the traditions that sort of have a similar language, but even though their liturgy is very different, their traditions, they have a different set of bishops, different patriarchs, things like that. And then you'll see in the literature the categorization, the Syriac churches. So Syriac is the dialect of Aramaic that Narsai and our church fathers wrote in. It's what we call Gushma, okay, the old language, whatever you want to call it, Lishana Atiqa, whatever you want to say. Is there something useful about that? It's useful if you're digging through manuscripts and you want to know what language the manuscript is in. It's useful if you're talking about language, and within the Syriac church's category, they'll divide it into West Syriac and East Syriac. What is that referring to? That's actually referring to a letter system. East Syriac is just the alphabet that we use, what we call the Chaldean or the Assyrian alphabet. That's called the East Syriac alphabet. And then the West Syriac is the one that you'll see the Suryoyo using. That's what East and West Syriac means. It's referring to an alphabet. I don't know if it's fair to name an entire church after an alphabet. Or, I'm not sure what meaning it has to categorize churches, group them together according, just because they happen to speak the same language. Traditionally, the other quote-unquote Syriac churches and the Church of the East were enemies. They were condemning each other. They were saying, you're a heretic. What do they have in common theologically? There are certain things that all the Christian churches from the apostolic time have in common, but we have that in common with the Latin church too. So what meaning does it have to say, well, these are the Syriac churches? Again, if you're digging through manuscripts and you want to categorize them and catalog them, it's useful. Otherwise, it doesn't really tell you anything. And so when I say specifically, let's call this just the Church of the East and be precise in our terminology, I have a reason for saying that, because to sort of use another kind of categorization, you're just going to confuse yourself. So that's, what do we mean when we say Narsai? He is a writer of the Church of the East. Let me see what else. I had to go through a rant on a couple of things before I got to his biography. Said all that. So a few things to note about the Church of the East. What is it? The church east of the Roman Empire. Aramaic speaking. Okay, in our liturgy and our writing. It was at some point later in history, after Narsai, or sort of towards the end of his life, associated with a teaching called Nestorianism and a writer called Nestorius, who was actually a Greek bishop. I am going to argue in this course that Narsai himself was not a Nestorian. I don't think he was, and I'm not aware of any writer current writer who says that he was, but that accusation was leveled against our church. I'm going to explain what that is when we get to those chapters. But there's a sort of heresy, a false teaching, sort of accused towards our church, that our church eventually sort of even accepted the name several hundred years after Narsai, and I think that even that was a mistake. So we're going to talk about Nestorianism in two different chapters as the weeks go by. So don't worry about that right now. Now I do want to say this. Most of you are Chaldean, which is nice. We should be, and I think you guys, anybody who knows me knows, we're very proud, or I'm very proud of a lot of the things that are in our tradition. They're so beautiful, they're so unique, they're so special, and I'm really, it takes work, but it's worth the work to like kind of fight for keeping these nice traditions alive in our community and especially in our church. I'm all about that. Now, there's a way though to be so extreme about some stuff that you start to define yourself as the opposite of everybody else. And that's a weird way to think about what a church is. So on the one hand, if you ask me, what's my preference? Should we pray Salat al-Sapra, like morning prayer before Mass? Or should we pray, or Ramsha, evening prayer before evening Mass? Should we do that, or should we do the Rosary? I like both. I pray both every day, and we do both here at the cathedral. You know, but which one comes right before Mass? Sort of the more prominent place. I would prefer Ramsha. I think it's, but to say, well, we don't pray the Rosary because we're Eastern. Why? What are you talking about? We don't pray this. We don't do that. I want to just illustrate. The Church of the East is its own unique thing. It's proud of what it is, but it also has the self-esteem to say, oh, that's cool. I'm gonna use that. Remember Qadisha Alaha? You guys go to church sometimes? You sing Qadisha Alaha? That's actually a Greek prayer that was translated into Aramaic by Mar Abba the Great, actually, our seminary patron. So we're open to things from the outside. If they're nice and they're compatible with what we do and they have a place, okay, cool. If they're not, or like we don't get rid of what we have to replace it with something just because the West has it. That'll be like haramat. You're kind of throwing something away just because, oh, that's shiny, I want the shiny thing. Well, shiny doesn't always mean better. But if something is cool and it's not going to hurt anything that I have, yeah, why not? So that our church is not totally closed off, but it does have the self-respect to retain what it has. So that's what we mean by the Church of the East. Narsai is a writer from the 5th century of that church. Now let's get into his life. And I'm going to kind of just page through my intro. So I'm on page 9 if you have the book with you. If not, don't worry about it. So, Mar Narsai was named the harp of the Spirit, which is also a name given to Mar Ephraim. So they're both given that name. The harp of the Spirit. Like the Holy Spirit plays them like a harp and makes beautiful music through them. That's the idea, which is cool because they both wrote very, very nice poetry. Narsai is also called the tongue of the East. That's cool too. No, both nice names. We know about Narsai's life from a 6th century author. So his biography comes very close to the end of his life. It's not like legends that were written down 500 years after he died. No, it was sort of within his lifetime, written at the school that he was the head of, that his biographies were written. So the name of the author that we rely on to know about Narsai's life was named Bar Hadab Shabba, which means the son of Sunday, which is a funny name. I don't know anybody else with that name. So the guys, Bar Hadab Shabba wrote 2 works that mention Narsai. One is called the Ecclesiastical History, and the other is called The Cause of the Foundation of the Schools. And both of these are available in English if you want to sort of do a deeper dive into his life. And one is the Cause of the Foundation of the Schools. There's a very fantastic English translation by my friend Adam Becker. So you can find that on Amazon. It's a really, really cool read. So those are the sources that we learned about his life. What do we know about his life? He lived for a long time. He was born around 400 or 410. I guess I could write on the board. I'll do some stuff on the board. So when he was around 7, he was sent to the catechetical school of his village, which is called Ain Dulba, which is Deleb today. I don't know where that is, but it's somewhere, in Iraq or Kurdistan or whatever, yeah. So 7 years old, he was sent to his village catechetical school. That tells us a lot. That by itself tells us a lot about the way the world was at the time. That means it was a common thing for villages to have schools teaching the faith. What did he learn when he got there? He learned how to read. That means people were literate. And it says that within 9 months, 7-year-old Narsai, within 9 months, not only was able to read really fluently, the alphabet that I had on here a little while ago when I was teaching the Chaldean class, 7-year-old Narsai within 9 months, the sources say he had memorized the entire Psalter, all the Psalms. Now, I have heard many scholars kind of make fun of this. Oh, whatever, it's just a legend, they just exaggerate things. He was a great writer, they want to inflate things. I actually don't think that's that surprising or that insane, that impossible. Have you met a 7-year-old? Have you seen how quickly they memorize their favorite songs? Have you seen how obsessive they can be? So a decently smart 7. Now, there's 150 Psalms of David. So it's going to be kind of hard. However, you're at a catechetical school. That means you're near the cathedral. That means you're listening to Shamash pray the Psalms several times a day. And you're going to hear them over and over and over again. It's not like Narsai sat there with a Bible in a quiet room with a candle and with glasses on and memorized them word for word. He heard them all the time. And I bet, those of you, there's a couple seminarians here, when you're in the seminary for 9 months, and I just pull you out, and we're dumb compared to Narsai, so like a dumb dude like me, and I'm in the seminary for 9 months, pull me out. How many Psalms do you know? Oh, I actually accidentally memorized 30 Psalms just from going to prayer. So if you're kind of smart and you put your mind to it, I don't think it's impossible. So I just kind of want to defend that as a possibility. Historians really hate anything that's, if anybody's not perfectly normal, they dismiss it and they throw it away. Why? Sometimes people are smarter than you are. You know what I mean? So I don't think it's totally impossible that Narsai had done this by the time he was 7 years old. Anyway, 9 months, he was smart. He was already known to be sort of very holy, very kind of kind. Sometime during his first year, so he's again a 7-year-old. What does a 7-year-old look like? I have no idea what children are. Are they like that tall? Just imagine like a little 7-year-old, right? Okay. How old's your daughter? Okay, so like a little taller than Max. Okay. So like a little kid, and he's walking around or whatever. Okay. So you imagine this little kid. During that first year, there was some kind of persecution had happened near his village. We don't know anything about it. We don't really. There was some kind of sword happening. That's what the sources say. And due to the sword, the armies went into that village, and his teacher took his class and they ran to the mountains. This is what the sort of story says. So you imagine there's this army coming in. Oh my gosh, let's go. We got to go hide. So he took the whole class. I don't know how many people there were, how many kids there were, and they ran to the mountains to hide from this army. And it says that during that time, it's called the gloom of the persecutors. That's what the author says. During that time, the little 7-year-old Narsai was like quoting Psalms, and he's telling them to be encouraged, and it's going to be okay, and God is going to save us. So that's really cute. It's a cute image. This little kid, and he's telling his classmates, oh, it's going to be okay, everybody. He's quoting the Bible to them. Cute, right? Again, I don't see that very implausible. And then when the army left, they went down. We don't know if that lasted a couple hours, or if they were there for a couple of days, or a couple months, or what. It just says when that ended, they went back to class, or they went back to the village. So I don't know. It could have been like a couple of hour thing, like, oh, that's kind of scary, and we're no, it's going to be okay. And then they left. I don't. So again, I'm kind of disagreeing with some of the like really skeptical scholars. They just, they're just making these legends up. Why? You can see that happen, Okay. Then he went and studied for 9 more years, and then when he was 16, his parents died. So orphan, he was already starting into manhood, but his parents died when he was 16. And his uncle, named Emmanuel, sent him, who was a former student. Now I have to tell you about some schools that were more important. He was a student at a school called the School of the Persians. Let me write that on the board. The School of the Persians. That's the official name of the school in the city of Edessa. Okay. Now, his uncle was an abbot of a monastery, a student of this school from Edessa, and so he invited him to start teaching. He's an abbot. Narsai is 16 years old, but he's really smart. So his uncle, who's an abbot, is like, hey, you're really smart. Can you come teach at our school? So Narsai is invited to go teach. This is where we start to really see his personality. Narsai says, okay, cool, I will go teach. He teaches for less than a year. It doesn't say he hates it, but he's not the biggest fan. And so he leaves after a year, and where does Narsai go? So he's like around 17 this time. Where does he go? To the School of the Persians in Edessa. Narsai's personality, the thing that seems like that comes out clearest in the sources, Barhadav Shabba, is he was somebody who wanted to sit and read and study and not do anything else. And he kept getting dragged into all kinds of other stuff. Okay? So the guy just wanted to sit and meditate on the Bible, and they kept saying, well, no, you got to teach here. He's like, oh, he goes and teaches them, he just leaves. Okay? We're going to find that happen. Now, and there's going to be sort of a pattern to this that the biographer is going to bring out. So he goes to that monastery school, teaches for a year. He probably gets annoyed of the monks. He leaves. Okay. Can't blame him. I'm just kidding. I love them. Okay. Are the monks here? I know. I think some of them are coming. Are they here? Oh, there you are. What's up, guys? Love you guys. I have a nun too. Man, it's like a multicultural classroom. Okay. In the School of Edessa, I want to tell you, this was a very famous school. It was called the School of the Persians. The legend says that this school was founded by Saint Ephraim. which maybe is possible. I haven't really looked that much into that. And there's actually a lot of sources and books about this school. There's a couple of good authors. When you get my book, you can look in the biography. There's one called Vubis, and then Adam Becker's doctoral dissertation was on this, the eventual school that arose when Narsai and the students here moved to Nisibis. We'll get to that in a second. So there's a lot of good reading to do on how the school systems were working at the time. Schools at the time of Narsai were sort of, they were not monasteries. I mean, the ones that were not monasteries, they're just universities. They weren't monasteries, but it was expected that while you were living there, you were celibate. So you go there before you're married. Okay? And while you're there, it's expected that you pray and live like a monk. And then when you're done, you leave and you can do whatever you want. But while you're there, there was a kind of strict regime of lifestyle. And you had to get up and you had to pray and you had to go to class and you had to study and read and whatever. And then at night you got to pray and then you got to sleep at this time. And there's dorms. It was a very strict kind of lifestyle. So Narsai went and he loved it. The kinds of things that they would study there are actually somewhat known. And we know within Narsai's lifetime, the actual sort of what books they were reading. And it's obviously it's the Bible, but you also have some theological sources, and they're already starting to translate some Greek authors. They're obviously reading Ephraim. They're even translating some Greek authors already by the time of Narsai. And what they're already starting to read and translate is philosophy. Even at the time of Narsai, in the 400s, they're starting to translate Aristotle into Aramaic towards the end of Narsai's life for the use in these schools. And we know that part of their curriculum, very sort of overlapping his life, we know that part of his curriculum was Aristotle's logical works, the Categories and the rest of the Organon. So if you know anything about philosophy, that's very interesting. You don't usually associate Aristotle with Christian schools until Thomas Aquinas many, many centuries later. But our church was already doing that before the Latin church was doing it. Yeah. Augustine had just died. And so if we translate Augustine from Latin, it had to go into Greek first and then into Aramaic. So I actually don't know of any Augustine that was ever translated into Aramaic. Yeah. Augustine's a very interesting thinker, and there are going to be a couple of things that Narsai says that are remarkably similar to some of the stuff Augustine says. Just random, just out of nowhere, like when the creation having to do with teaching the angels. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So there's some things that are interesting parallels, even though he's about a century later than Augustine. But yeah, no, you don't have an Augustine. You have some Gregory. You have lots of Theodore of Mopsuestia, which we'll see why that's important later. Good question, though. Thank you. Okay. So he's there. He's doing his studies, and he's there for 10 years. So now he's mid-20s, late 20s. Then his uncle, who is a bishop now, says, Haramat, like I'm upset, I'm sad that this poor guy is happy. Let me ruin his day. He says, come back, and I want you to teach. And now I want you to teach again. And he has 300 students. So he went, and the biographer says he taught them for, quote, a brief period. Then, this is where there's a little bit of debate, and I'm personally not even sure as a writer what actually happened. But Hadab Sheba, the author, says, then he went back to Edessa for 10 more years. If that actually happened, that means Narsai lived to be about 103 years old. If it didn't happen, he was about 93. Now, what are the reasons to believe it did or didn't? Now, is it possible that somebody could live that long? Absolutely. I'm not saying it's impossible. Is it possible that the exact same thing happened to Narsai twice? Yes, it's possible. So many things happened to me a million times, and I still don't learn my lesson. But what I think Hadab Sheba is doing is making a three-part structure for Narsai's life. He wants to say, he went to Edessa for 10 years, taught for a little while. Went to Edessa for 10 years, taught for a little while. Then, the third thing is what? He goes back to Edessa after this little while. By then, they invited Narsai to become the head of this school. That's how smart and popular and loved he was. So now it's kind of funny. He wants to stop teaching. I'm going east because that's where he was teaching. He wants to stop teaching so that he can go back and study. So he goes back to his school to study, and they make him start teaching by popular demand. Then we have a little description in the sources of the kind of person he was. He was a priest, we know that. He was an elegant speaker, apparently. So I had one thing in common with him, now it's lost. He was a humble and holy man, not at all. So I like to think I have something in common, but I have just that one thing, I'm a priest. So then Narsai said, okay, I will teach, except he wanted only to sort of teach the Bible. That's all he was interested in teaching. He wanted to interpret the scriptures. So the stuff of like the alphabet and this, like the basic stuff, he didn't want to teach Aristotle. He just wanted to interpret the scriptures. And so they agreed to that. So he was sort of the graduate school instructor. He didn't want to teach undergrads, basically. And it says that he did that for 20 years. Then we have the second part of Narsai's life. At that point, the Nestorian heresy. Let me just give you a 5-second description of the Nestorian problem. The Nestorian debate was a bishop in Constantinople, in Turkey, a Greek-speaking bishop in Constantinople, got into an argument with a Greek-speaking bishop in Egypt, in Alexandria. The bishop in Constantinople was named Nestorius. The bishop in Alexandria was named Cyril. Thank you. Cyril and Nestorius got into an argument about whether it's proper to say that Mary is the mother of God, which was a title. It's not in the Bible, but it's a title that people in Alexandria were using in their prayers and in their liturgies. And so Nestorius is like, I mean, is Mary the mother of God the Father? Is she the mother of the Holy Spirit? Did she produce God the Word? Was there no God the Word? Was there no Father, Son, and Holy Spirit before Jesus was born, before Mary was around? So he was saying, like, why don't we stick to the titles that are there in the Bible? She's called the mother of our Lord. Isn't that good enough? Cyril was like, no, Christ is one, and he's God, and she's his mother, so she's the mother of God. Which we use the title today. There's nothing like wrong, incorrect about it, as long as we understand it correctly. Nestorius didn't agree with it. The more they argued, the more it became clear that the disagreement wasn't just about words, and it wasn't just about Mary. It was actually about Jesus. If Mary is the mother of Jesus the man, but Jesus the man is God, how are we to understand that? How are we to understand that Jesus is both God and man at the same time? The church had not yet developed the precise terminology we have today to describe what's going on with that. That disagreement got very, very intense. There were councils called. I have a lot to say about that, but I'm going to save it to when we get to those chapters on this topic. But there were councils called. By that time, the school of the Persians had sort of taken the side of Nestorius. And by then, the side of Nestorius was starting to be very unpopular in the Roman Empire, where Edessa was. And so that means, so a guy named Cyrus, the bishop of Edessa, accused Narsai of heresy and kicked him out. And in fact, it wasn't even just a heresy thing, it was kind of a racist thing. So the quote is, they thought, quote, how can a Persian man subdue the Romans, this man who was a foreigner to the order of reason? So they didn't like that Narsai was so smart, but from Persia. So there's a little bit of that going on. I mean, that's what the historical sources say. They were saying that Narsai, they're like, so the guy, Cyrus, the bishop of this city where the school was, basically, so how can this guy who's from Persia, which we look down on as a empire, have all this, how can he subdue the Romans? How can he keep winning these debates with people that are from the Roman Empire? He was upset about it. That's what the quote comes down to us as. And so he accused him of heresy, of being a Nestorian, and he accused him, this is going to this is very familiar to people that know the history of the Church of the East. He accused him of being a spy against the Roman Empire. So he told the Roman authorities, this is what kind of punk this guy was, he told the Roman authorities that this guy Narsai teaching here was sent by the Persian Empire to spy on the Roman Empire. So Narsai, it says, quoted several passages from St. Paul to defend himself. And then he fled Edessa at night. So in the middle of the night, he left. And he asked some Persian friends from the school to bring his books with him, to carry his books, which he said, that's my whole treasure. All I have in my life is those books. I need them. So he got a couple of guys to carry his books with him back to the Persian Empire, to another city called Nisibis, where his friend Barsoma was bishop. I think it's exciting, isn't it? He had a dramatic life, kind of, for just a guy that taught at a school. Okay. So he goes to Nisibis. And here's where, so now we have these we have these three. I think Biography Shab is a very interesting author. He likes to structure things. Narsai went to Edessa 3 times, each time for 10 or 20 years. So 1, 2, 3 trips to Edessa. We also have, for the second half of his life, a kind of 3-part structure. In this case, it's not trips. In this case, it's writing, what his writing does. So his first writing, he wrote a letter to the people at the school of the Persians, people in Edessa, which silenced their accusations and shamed them. So the second half of Narsai's life that the author is giving us is about how powerful his writing is, and how he actually, it's sort of the miracle of Narsai, according to Biography Shab, is he actually can convince people. And people hear his words and they're like, oh, I guess you're right. And that's sort of this deep, because I've never in my life talked to somebody who I disagreed with and gave them my point of view and had them say, oh, that's a good point. Has anybody ever seen that on the internet, for example? In the history of the internet, nobody has ever changed their mind. I'm just kidding, I'm slightly exaggerating, but you guys know how hard it is to actually reason with somebody and have them say, oh, okay, I guess you're right. There's pride, there's all kinds of stuff involved, whatever. So Narsai's first sort of quote unquote miracle is he writes a letter to Edessa, to the people of Edessa. That's the first sort of 3-part structure of his biography. He gets to Nisibis. He wants to just pass through, but the bishop Barsoma sends some priests out to say, oh, you got to stay. God brought you here in his providence because the bishop of Nisibis, Barsoma, needed somebody to head his school. Now, Narsai was not the first leader of the school of Nisibis. It was a guy named George, I think, who Narsai replaced. His name was Simeon. So this guy Simeon was in charge of the school. Narsai shows up. Simeon was like, oh, dude, you're in charge. I've heard about you. Simeon very humbly had heard of Narsai already. He's like, I would love to step down and have you take charge. And Narsai did that. And he was there. And because he was so famous, this school was eventually closed down by the bishop. All the students moved to Nisibis to study with Narsai. Okay? And the school of Nisibis was the most important university in Mesopotamia for centuries. It was the Oxford of the Persian Empire. It was the University of Paris of the Persian Empire. Every great bishop and author and writer for several centuries either went to the school or studied under somebody who went to this school. So it was this very, very, you can sort of name and list all the people that studied here. It was a great center of learning. Okay. And it was really because of Narsai. He kind of established it. And you have a lot of great historical sources on the school of Nisibis, which you can find in the book. All right. Then it gets really, now we're going to get some dramatic stuff. Narsai's there. He's in Nisibis. He's really popular. He's friends with Barsoma. Barsoma is famous for other reasons, which I don't want to get into in this class, but we'll leave him there for a second. Who gets upset at Narsai's popularity? There's a very prominent characteristic of the clergy of the Church of the East, which is envy, jealousy between each other. And I really try to fight that, and it's important for all of us, Chaldean priests and Assyrian priests and all of us to fight that in ourselves, but it's something that's there in a lot of clergy and it's very particular in our church. Barsoma was not jealous of Narsai. His wife was. Now, it's actually not clear how the history happened. Barsoma eventually, one of the things he's famous for is he held a local synod on his own without the patriarch that declared any clergyman is allowed to get married. Priest, bishop, or patriarch. And then he got married. It's a big embarrassing thing in the history of our church, whatever, it happened. The weird thing is, if you look at that council, it's called the Synod of Beth Lafat, I think it's called, yeah. That's supposed to have happened in 484. This problem happened a little earlier, so there's something wrong with the dates. I think probably what happened is Barsoma was already living with this woman, calling her his wife, and then he sort of validated it later. So anyway, this guy's wife, quote unquote, whose name was Memre, was jealous of that Narsai was more popular than her husband, the bishop. And so she got him kicked out of Nisibis. Memre. Then we have something very interesting. He spent 6 years in the monastery, it's called the monastery of Kafar Mari in Beth Zabde. Now, this is a very important historical note. While he was there, number 2, it says Narsai wrote 2 memre. I'm going to tell you what a memre is in a second. He wrote 2 memre. Memre are metrical sermons. So they're sermons, he's preaching on some part of the Bible, but they're poetry, they're rhythmic. And they have a certain number of lines, usually 12. I'll tell you a little bit about his poetry next class. So it says he wrote 2 memre, and we know the titles of them, and we still have them both, actually. One of them, actually both of these memre are kind of negative. The topic of one of them is about how life is so miserable, and the other one is about how evil women are. Okay, don't clap for that. You're never going to get married. You have to act offended. We all do. Okay, so he wrote 2 memre. Okay, one about how life sucks and one about how women are terrible. Okay? I'm going to tell you why that's important in a minute, but that's the second sort of writing that he did. The second one he sent to Barsoma. So the one about how women are so terrible, he sent to that bishop. Right? I like his attitude. And for the second time, Narsai's writings produced an effect in his adversaries. So when Barsoma read this memra, he changed his mind. He didn't divorce his wife, but he apologized to Narsai and he said, please come back. Interesting, right? Amazing. The miracle that you wrote something and it changed somebody's mind. That's really what's going on with Bar Hadib Shabba's biography. So Narsai said, you know what? Thank you for repenting or whatever. And he went back and he got a place of residence really far away from the bishop. Because before he was sort of like the school and his apartment was sort of near the cathedral where the Memre was living. And so this time he's like, I'll come back to Nisibis, but I'm not living next door to you anymore. And he did that. Then we have a little description in the biography of Narsai's lifestyle. This is the way he's described his living. 1 meal per day in the evening. So he was doing the, what do they call that? Intermittent fasting. So he was lean. I guess, I don't know. He was 1 meal per day in the evening. He just had a simple mat for a bed. He stayed up really late at night in meditation on the liturgy and the scriptures. And he sort of, his lifestyle is described as angelic. So that's, we just, like the author just sort of says, you know what, let me just describe how he lived right now. So he just describes him in that way. Then we have a very, very important biographical thing. When he comes back to Nisibis, Narsai is informed of somebody back over here named Jacob, who is younger than Narsai. Jacob of a city called Srog. They spell it Serug in English. Jacob of Srog, who is one of the most important writers in the Syriac language. He wrote a ton. This guy was writing on this side, on the anti-Nestorian side. And he was writing memre, the same style of metrical poem. And it says he was starting to win people over to this side of the sort of theological fence because his writing was so sweet. Okay. Then the author, the biographer says, Barhadab says, imitating King David, Narsai started to write his own memre in response to Jacob. Okay, this is the debate, and this is, it really has to be like Middle Eastern people that are behind this debate, because the argument is, who invented this style of writing? Was it Narsai or was it Jacob? Who gets to take credit? Now, there's an important point to make here. This genre was already being written by Saint Ephraim, and he may have actually invented memre. But this is how petty the argument is, just so you know how petty scholars can be. The argument is, well, Ephraim wrote memre in 7 syllables per line. You see how petty we are? The argument is not even over who invented the metrical sermon. The argument is who invented the 12-syllable metrical sermon, Narsai or Jacob? You see how stupid we are as a human race? However, I'm also petty, and here's my argument for why Narsai invented them. Because the argument that Jacob invented them is this source, Barhadab Shabba, who says, well, Narsai was responding to Jacob. And he started writing these memre to respond to Jacob. It's the same source that I'm talking about right now, Barhadab Shabba. The same exact source, though, just a couple pages earlier says, Narsai wrote these two while he was gone, before any mention of Jacob. And these two memre we still have, and they're both 12 syllables per line. So the same source that you can argue that Jacob invented it, actually it confirms that Narsai was already doing it. Cool, huh? So I call this the Narsaian meter. I don't care what anybody says. Anyway, you see how petty I am? I'm a very petty person. Anyway, so he wrote memre, and this book is a translation of 12 of his memre on different topics, which I guess I'll go through real quick. So the rest of the bio goes like this. He wrote 12 volumes of memre, according to Barhadab Shabba, apparently something around 360 different sermons. Each of them is about 12 to 15 pages, so nice kind of, for actual sermons, like they would have been long. It would have been like longer than like, I don't want to name names, but like certain priests. Okay, we only have about 82 or 83 left out of the 360 that he supposedly wrote. So that's sad. If he actually wrote 360 and we lost that many of them, that's very sad because the ones that we have are gorgeous. One of them that some of you are probably familiar with is Wednesday of Ba'utha, the third day of Ba'utha. all the prayers we say on that day are just one of Narsai's memre that are cut apart and sung in different melodies. So that's one of his memre. That's a gorgeous one. If you have gone to Wednesday Ba'utha, it's beautiful. Even in my terrible English translation, it's gorgeous. Okay, it's not because of me; it's because of him. So that's one of the things that we use in our liturgy. Anyway, so we have about 82, 83 of them. There's a couple that are debated. We're not sure if he wrote them or not, but that's what we have out of a possible 360. Anyway, he's back in Nisibis. He's teaching. He's writing. He's doing his thing. Then more people are annoyed with him and kind of jealous and whatever. The Persian king, Peres I, lost some battle, and he lost the battle probably because he was being very prideful and he didn't back off when he should have backed off. Narsai wrote a memra about how bad pride is. Okay. Some of the king's troops told the king, now look what happened. This is another very familiar thing. They took this memra and they told the king, Narsai is against you and he's a spy for the Roman Empire. You see the irony? When he was in Edessa, they accused him of being a spy for the Persian Empire. When he's in Persia, they accuse him of being a spy for the Roman emperor. So, some people heard that accusation had been made. Narsai wrote another memra praising the Persian Empire and how great it is. And he sent it to the Persian king, and it changed his mind again. So that's the third one. Third, Persian king. Cool, huh? And then he taught for a long time, and then he died. In around 503. There's also supposedly he predicted the death of some Persian guy, so he had some prophetic gifts. He healed this boy who had been possessed by a demon. There's other side stories, but this is sort of the structure of his life. Now, again, to summarize what kind of person and life he had, so he really just wanted to sit and read and pray. God wanted him to teach and to take care of these institutions. And so it's a kind of, it's a very interesting sort of story of a man and his holy desires, but God has other plans for him, being pulled back and forth. And through his contemplation and his love for the scriptures, which we're going to see, his memra are amazing and deeply insightful. Through that, God uses his love for the scriptures to teach and enlighten others. And I think there's something great about that. When we love God, well, we're expected to love our neighbor as well. Narsai was sort of leaning on one side, and God was like, well, don't forget about these guys too. Yes, love me and love the scriptures, but you're responsible for teaching others as well. So I think there's something kind of beautiful about that kind of life. We have the power of his writing over here, and we have the other, the first part of his struggle with prayer versus service over here, and the part of the power of his writing is on the second half of his life. Let me make a couple of comments. Again, let me repeat for those of you who came in a little late. This course today was just a biography on who Narsai is. Next week, I'm going to do a summary of his theology, a kind of speed run through as much of his theological thought that could be unified into one big vision next week. Not next week, next class.